see my
Very well.
face, my
How are you?
response. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks.
I got so turned around. I kept thinking that this was going to be at 2 p.m. my time, and I
Oh,
put on the calendar, and I was like, okay, it's going to be 2 p.m. Central Time, but it didn't take in.
okay.
But anyways, we're fine.
Are you on Central Time?
No, I'm in Eastern
Eastern
Time,
Time. Oh boy.
but we're fine. We're okay.
Okay. Cool. Well, let's get into it so I don't waste too much of your time.
All right, sounds good.
Let me start with a simple question. Tell me about yourself. A little about what you do as a podcaster. I'm going to be recording,
Okay, for
so I
sure.
don't have to take notes.
Yeah. So, as a podcaster, what do I do? It's a great question. Now there is some noise in the background because we have uh, some people in the kitchen working.
That's okay.
Um, how I started as a podcaster was all really an interesting journey. It all started because number one, I'm a technologist. I love tech. I love software, delving into different things. And when I learned about podcasting back in 2011, I was like, hey, this is a pretty cool medium. What else can I learn about it? So in 2012, myself and two of my cousins, we started a podcast called Still Brewing It because number one, we've had this group chat going for at least 15 years and we talk about technology. And I was like, hey, how about we do a podcast? So we did like 4 episodes. We were in different time zones. Didn't really work out as much as I wanted. So finally in 2018, I launched my podcast called Hacks and Hobbies. And it was all thanks to Gary Vaynerchuk. I had finished reading his book called Crushing It, and he said, just go and document the process, document the journey. And around the same time, I was helping somebody else launch their podcast. They just had, showed up out of nowhere, not out of nowhere, but um, I've been helping them with sites for over a decade, and he came to me and he's like, "Hey, I want to launch a podcast, and I know you did it before. Help me." So I was doing research again, and I ran into Anchor, which made it so much easier to record a podcast.
Hmm.
Just record it on your phone.
Oh,
Oh my God, mind blown! I can record videos on my phone. I can record, take pictures. Why not audio? So
that's
my first episode. So that's where basically how I started.
that's interesting. So is that the platform you still use? Do you still use your phone to record your podcasts?
No, I
Okay.
don't. Not anymore. But every once in a while, I'll record audio snippets on my phone, and I'll bring them into the audio editing platform that I use and clean it up in there. And there's really cool things that you can do with this platform, especially if I'm riding my bike or I'm out with the kids and I wanted to just record some notes. I'll
Hmm.
record on the phone and then use that audio bit on my podcasts.
Well, that's
Not as often as I want to, though. Now it's mainly just interviews with other guests and entrepreneurs.
cool, cool. So I did go to your website and I did go look at some of your podcasts, and I noticed that your topic is I can't say you have a topic. It's
It's very
very,
broad.
yeah, very broad. So what what really drives the material that you bring into your podcast?
That's an excellent question. And when I was starting the podcast, everybody, not just everybody, like Pat Flynn's like, you got to niche down. You got to niche down to one specific topic so that you can be an expert in that area. Well, I didn't understand that concept till last year.
Okay.
And so, but the main theme of the entire podcast, or the guests that I bring in, is to learn their journey. And as I listen to over 200 people that I interviewed on the podcast, I started seeing patterns. I started seeing their journey. I started seeing how they tell their story, and it started to make sense to me. It started to say, hey, I've got a ton of stories that I can go back to, relate to, and put them in a context that applies to the question at hand. So the main theme is journey, the growth, the transformation that people bring into their lives in whatever space that they might be in. But how are they taking that one thing and making it the main thing for themselves? So you start with a side hustle, you start with a hobby, but then your passion shows through, and because that passion and the audience reaction that you get from that passion, from you showing up around that passion, you become known for that specific thing, that expertise. The one example that really resonate with me was I can't remember this actor's name. He basically started a site with his brother called Hit Record. Um, it's gonna hit me on my mind. I see his tweets almost every single day, and I can't remember his name right now. He's a pretty well known actor. He's been, anyways, Joseph Gordon-Levitt. So him and his brother, they started this site called Hit Record. Like, what's the worst that can happen? Just hit record and start a video. So they started this as a hobby almost 10 years ago, and now it's got a huge community of hundreds of thousands of people. They've had Emmy and Grammy award winning movies on here that came out as a collaboration. And when he interviewed on Tim Ferriss's show, is all about, he just started as a hobby, and they didn't even know where it was going to go, but because they showed the passion, it's now, that's the full-time thing that they do besides the acting that he does, right? So looking at stories from other people, looking at their journeys, it enabled me to see my own journey, enabled me to see my own things that I've been doing in my own way, and bringing basically like full circle, like, oh, that's what niching down really means. Like, unless you've walked the path, unless you've seen that transformation in yourself, it's really hard. It's really hard to see that.
Yeah, it's really hard to niche down the way the experts tell you to do so.
Yes.
I noticed from mine as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
being specific about one thing when in reality, people that are, that you're talking to are from all different walks of life. So,
Yeah.
what do you think about now that you're more focused on niching down versus when you were doing all the different topics?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference or the effect to your podcasting?
I think the difference in the effect in my podcasting, it all comes down to which face am I putting in front of the public, or what posts as I am I creating for the public, because sure, I'm still a bit scattered on my social media posts, but I still have this grand vision. Like, sure, I'm still involved in tons of different things, my hobbies, and that's the podcast, right? Hacks and Hobbies. I'm figuring out different shortcuts and different ways to, you know, gain momentum, or hack your day so that you're being more productive, or you know, different ways to get more efficient. And I still have a ton of hobbies, but the one thing that I've been able to focus on is building the studio, building this space out, and helping other people build out their home spaces, their home studios better. I
Wow.
think that's the main thing that has changed. I mean, I'm still scattered brain up here, but the face that I'm putting forward, I'm trying to be more and more um, more and more intentional with that.
That's awesome. Now, starting up your podcast, I know we talked about you starting out with a phone. What is there a special software? Is there a special platform that you use to put your information together?
Sure.
Raw?
Absolutely. So there are several applications, several apps on your phone that you can use to, number one, record the audio. That's very easy. You know, we've had voice memos, we've had the microphone app, and you can record audio in many different ways. But the one thing that makes a difference is how do you publish this audio? If I record using the camera app on my phone, the video, well, I can publish it on Vimeo through the Vimeo app, or I can go to the YouTube app to publish the video there. But for audio, there isn't much platform. Now that we're seeing a lot more audio coming into view thanks to Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces and Fireside Chat by Marc Cuban. Anchored FM was such app that had started probably 2016, end of 2016, somewhere around that. It started as a messaging app where you can leave a voice message for other people that are using the same app. And then eventually they developed it into a full-on podcasting app. So you can go in there, record your podcast, you can layer the tracks, you can add music to it, you can even call other people through the app to then have that conversation and record that conversation and then go on and publish it. So it was a one-stop shop that Anchor provided. They're now a Spotify company, right? Spotify spent the money and bought Anchor.fm. And I know there are other podcast hosting services. There's a ton of them out there now. This one has still worked for me pretty well. And it's just made it really easy. They do the propagation to all other distribution platforms for you. So you just go to Anchor FM, sign up for your account, and you say, okay, this is going to be my podcast name. Then they'll go and propagate your podcast to other platforms. The one thing that I recommend, or even they'll recommend, is hey, as soon as you think of what your podcast is going to be, record a little trailer, a little introduction to your podcast and when it's going to be launched, and push it out there. That enables them to then start getting your podcast live on other platforms. Because I think, yeah.
So they're still in existence, you're saying?
Yes.
Spotify? Okay, that sounds cool. That sounds easy. That sounds
it's
doable.
very simple, very easy. You could do it on your phone. So here's the funny part. So my first episode on the podcast was called Queen Bee, and it was kind of like a joke to my friend, like, hey, you should talk about Queen Bee, you know, who's Beyonce. I'm like, what? I had no idea. So I talk about that in my car on that first episode, and it's still available to listen to the podcast. I didn't change anything about it. I had no idea what the podcast was going to be called, but I was like, you know, this is gonna work. I mean, this is just the journey that I'm on. So my first season was all recorded in my car using a headset and a iPad. So I would just use the iPad to record while I was in commute back and forth from work. Then season 2 and season 3, I came and started doing it from home.
Interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day and she told me that she does all her recording on Zoom. So it's interesting how creative, you know, the platforms can be. So good to know. So what challenges have you overcome? What challenges have you run into, and which ones have you overcome?
And there's a ton of challenges. One of the first challenges that I faced was, well, you've recorded your episode, now you've got to edit it. And because we are, when we listen to our own voice or when we're looking at our own document, proofreading and whatnot, we'll find mistakes for days on end, for hours on end. So I would be spending anywhere from 2 to 3 hours editing one episode. And that was kind of a big problem because it affected, everything else that I was doing in life.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sleeping enough, so that was a big problem. And everybody in the beginning was like, you need to hire a podcast editor, somebody to edit your podcast. I'm like, no, I know this. I mean, I've used software for ages. I'm efficient with software. I can do it myself. But what you don't pay attention to is hey, how much time are you going to be spending on it? And so that happened. So I ended up hiring an editor. So that's how I solved my problem. I hired an editor, and then a lot of stress had lifted off of my head. I had recorded upwards of 20 interviews,
Wow.
and I was falling behind on editing these episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, this is not gonna be fun. So I've spent some money on the podcast, because I've had to hire somebody to edit the podcast episodes. The next problem that I faced was, okay, I've got the podcast edited. Now I've got to schedule it into the platform
Mm-hmm.
so that it can go out at the same time. I've got to have these custom images done. I've got to have the podcast transcription. I got to figure out what links we talked about in the podcast, what topics we talked about. So all of that was another level of, okay, this is a lot of research time that I don't have of. Luckily, around the same time, I had my virtual assistant, and she's been helping me with a lot of other tasks. And I was like, hey, we want to add these new tasks on here so you can help me with, getting the show notes together, getting the social media posts together, the custom covers. And here's the audio fill. So now we have a system in place where all I do is record the interview. I hand off the audio and the introduction to the podcast editor. He's got a template that he's gonna, he's building it off of. There's the music in the beginning, music at the end. There's a little bit promotion, little content in the middle for my own services, and then that comes together. And then so once he's done editing and he editing the audio, he then posts it up to our ClickUp, our project tracking software. So from there, the publisher will then grab the episode, schedule it on Anchor, and we're good to go. And then she's also scheduling social media posts to go out. Like, hey, look forward to this episode coming soon, or this is coming, or this is now available, kind of thing.
So cool.
So a ton of things that I would not have known if I had not taken the journey.
Yeah, of course. Now that brings me to the next question, which is it looks like there's a lot to do for podcasting. So what does it take to run a successful podcast?
That's a great question. So a successful podcast in the ways of efficiency would be, something that you have great systems in place.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have those systems in place, you have a team that handles it, then it's going to move forward smoothly, and all you have to do is show up. One gentleman that I follow, Nathan Lakta, he records 30 episodes in one weekend. So he'll spend 12 hours, he'll talk to 30 people.
Wow.
Mind you, he's only talking 5 to 10 minutes because it's short burst questions and answers.
Mm-hmm.
And then he hands it to his team that then goes around and does the publishing for him. So he's got a really tight system, but he has short episodes as well. So that's a really successful podcast, because not only is he talking to a very specific market, he's talking to CEOs of SaaS companies. There's a ton of SaaS companies that have been, popping up, So he'll talk to them. He'll find out, hey, how much money are they making? How many employees they have? What type of revenue generation? So all numbers, right?
Mm.
And now he's built a really solid infrastructure or a database where you can literally go and say, hey, I want to buy this SaaS company, and I can turn around in the next 6 to 18 months and, make millions. So
Wow.
there's that as well, because you're not starting from scratch anymore, because somebody's already done the work, and that's the hard stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So when you come in, the only thing that you got to work on is the promotion part. So a successful podcast would have systems in place, a tons of promotions that you're doing for your guests and your podcasts, and number three, showing up as guest on other podcasts. I heard somewhere that John Lee Dumas does 20 guest appearances per month.
Oh, that's a lot of guest appearances. That's a
It's a
lot.
lot of appearances, but each appearance is only 15 minutes long.
Okay.
But if anybody wants to be a guest on his podcast, they have to pay upwards of $3,000 to $5,000, because
Ooh,
the reach of his podcast is millions of people.
yeah, I can imagine. Yep. He definitely brings value, in
Yeah.
the audience. So now, do you use well, you do use experts, and I looked at your podcast. I noticed most of them are um, guest driven.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't get to your earlier podcast because you had a lot. I will
There's a
go
lot, yes.
back. I'll go back and look. But did you start off just doing solo podcasts and then grow to um, using guests? And how do you find your guests?
Yes. So my first season of my podcast was majority were all solo episodes. I did some experimentation using um, the interview feature inside of Anchor, and that got me connected with some people. Um, do you know where to go? So that was an experiment, and then towards the end, I did some Zoom calls, and those became interviews on the podcast. And it all came up to because there's only so much information that you can put out. And if I was more focused in the beginning, let's say, hey, this is a UX podcast, I'm just going to focus on user experience, or a photography podcast, I'm going to go all deep into about photography, that would have been a different angle altogether. I could talk about something in 10 to 15 episodes, and that would be it. That would be one podcast. And now I have a very focused podcast out there that people can, consume. But I didn't think of it from that standpoint, because again, I was just getting into it. So the first season was all just me talking about beekeeping, the life of bees, and my other hobbies. But then I was just curious. I was like, hey, I want to talk to other people who have podcasts. I want to talk to other people who have small businesses.
Mhm.
How do I get in touch with them? And I think I just looked in the communities. So I was part of the first Facebook Anchor community. Now they've gone to Slack, I think, but they still have a like a collaboration community on Facebook. So I just went in there like, hey, who's looking to be a guest, or who can I be a guest with, or talk together with. So I found a few people, talk with them. But now there's a ton of services. For example, Matchmaker.fm. There's podca- podcastbooker.com. There's many more places that you can find guests, or people will actually come and find you and say, hey, I want to be a guest on your podcast. But if I were to redo it and create a focused podcast, I would go to the niche place, um, specific groups, and go in there and be like, hey, I would like to bring you as a guest on my podcast because we talked about these specific things, and go that way. Hopefully that answered the question.
It did.
Okay.
It did, definitely.
Sometimes I'll go off on tangents and have my kitchen guy asking me some questions here as well.
Okay. Well, would you advise somebody that's brand new to podcasting to start looking for guests? Will guests agree to appear at somebody's brand new podcast? Like, what do you think about that?
So one thing that Patlin mentions is that if you're one of the first guests on a brand new podcast, well, you're a first, right? So it'll always be like, hey, my first episode was over here, or you're basically a first on all new podcasts. And again, based on what their launch strategy is, a lot of the times, new podcasts, what they'll do, they'll have a 3 to 5 to 10 new episodes launching on the same day.
Okay.
So you could be part of that launch, that launch program, because now you're a guest on this podcast where 10 people are promoting this podcast because it's falling on the same day. So based on that, it can bring a lot of traffic or none to your own podcast or to your own business or to your own area. Podcast is almost like, well, actually, based on what Seth Godin says, podcast guesting is similar to guest blogging. Because when you go blog on a popular blog, or you guest blog on a popular blog, well, people that have never heard of you before now know about you, and they can reach you and go to your own blog as well. I never really understood that philosophy. I didn't even know there was such a thing as guest blogging, because even though I had a couple of blogs, I still do. They just hang out with no traffic, right? I never thought of guest blogging or inviting in other folks' blogs, but it's similar. It's similar to that, because now you're not working super hard on bringing that audience. Their networks
Good.
are bringing the audience to your platform.
That's amazing. Yeah. So, tell me one surprising thing that a new podcaster probably would not know, um, or think about running into.
The number one thing you should know as you become a podcaster, or when you have a podcast, you're automatically number one on Apple's podcast list. As well as you can also apply for a media badge for any local events that are happening. Because you are a podcaster, you are creating content in the public domain. So you're automatically a media person, because you can report it on your podcast and get the word out to the people that are listening. So that's number one. I was like, what? I can go get a media tag on these events that are happening instead of paying $500-$600. So that was a one big surprise that I ran into.
That's interesting.
Yeah. What else did I have? The other thing that I learned was, because you are creating a conversation, you're having a conversation with podcast people are listening to in their ears when they have headphones on, or when they're doing something, if they're biking or running or whatever. My friend Angel, he says, I listen to all of you guys' podcasts when I'm mowing the lawn.
There you go.
Right. So it's a perfect multitask companion. So instead of listening to music or the news, you're listening to your best friend be on the podcast. So that was another cool, surprising thing that I learned.
That's cool. What methods do you use to monetize your podcast? I think that's the most important for a lot of online business people. It's like we're spending so much time doing all of this stuff. How do I pay myself? So,
I wrote a note down earlier. It's right here. This is Chipotle's ex-CEO. And so he was being interviewed by Vision, and he was saying, if your goal is to make a lot of money, that is the first indication that you're not going to make a lot of money. Right? People like you and I, or actually most people, are not well. I don't know. They don't relate money to the same thing as time. Like a lot of people say time equals money. I say that is not true.
not true. Yeah.
Because time you can't get back. Money you can always get back. You can always do something to get even 3 times the money back. So, um, one way to monetizing that I've done so far is by charging people to be on my podcast, because I'm spending my energy, not just my energy, but I'm also promoting them, and it's also a tax write off because it's an expense. It's a marketing expense for an entrepreneur, for a beginner. In fact, I recently found out that the government will pay you up to or you can claim up to $5,000 marketing expense if you've marketed your business one way or another. And being a guest on a podcast is a marketing expense. So that's one way to monetize. Other ways to monetize is to have ads playing or sponsorships for your podcast. Let's say your podcast is a very niche area and you're talking about products or you're talking about certain services. You can drive people back to as an affiliate market, or as not just affiliate, but also say, hey, I'm going to be bringing a ton of traffic to your site through this podcast because you have a public voice. You are People listen to you as a podcaster, so it brings authority in your voice. So I think that is another way to monetize. So sponsorship, ads, charging for episodes. Because another thing that you can do, for example, I'm a technologist and I'm somebody um, that's helping people set up their studio spaces. So I'm consulting with them. So based on that, I can literally say, hey, for the next 1 hour, I'm going to listen to the problems that you're having and come up with solutions for you on the call. So it's like a consultation, and I could take that recording and make it available for other people to listen to. So it's two-way street. You can use that time in recording as a lesson that other people can listen in and take away information and take notes and whatnot. Um, but also you're valuing your time as well.
Hey, we're almost done here. Um, One more question. Let's see. Actually, I have two more questions.
Sure.
What's your launch strategy?
What's my launch strategy?
Mm-hmm.
I almost want to do a relaunch for my podcast,
Okay.
which would be launch or get 10 episodes ready
Mm-hmm.
and tell my guests, hey guys, we're going to be launching your episode on this day. Get ready, kind of thing, and tell your audience, because they've been waiting to listen to you talk and whatnot. So that's one thing. So that way, 10 to 15 to 20 people are now promoting your podcast and getting you out there. What this does is that you can immediately, if you're launching a new podcast, you can immediately show up as top top newsworthy podcast for in this specific category. So being very intentional. For example, our good friend with the Positive Parenting podcast, I think she's rated pretty high up there. A good friend of mine has a podcast called First Class Fatherhood, and where he's interviewing other guests from around the world, as well as from actors from Hollywood and the screen. And he's rated one of the top podcasts because it's parenting information or parenting knowledge that a ton of people can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And it also comes with that star power, like, hey, I interviewed Matthew McConaughey or the guy from Rolling Stones and whatnot.
So cool. Okay. So give me one advice that you'll give to anyone that's thinking of starting a new podcast.
That's a great question. What I like to say is, where is it? My quote. Technology is easy. The hardest thing to do is to get comfortable in talking to the camera or talking on the microphone. Because a lot of times you're going to be like, oh, I want to do this, this, and this. But then as soon as you start talking, you can't find the words. It's almost like you want to script it. But I think just getting started and going down the lane is so much more important than anything else. And the one thing that I learned by recording in the car by myself was that I just got started. I didn't know what it was going to be. And you learn from your own mistakes. You learn from your own journey. This gentleman I met on Glenn, can't remember his last name, but he said, when you go to the store, you don't prepare your questions, or you don't prepare what you're going to say to the cashier.
Yeah.
You just go about life, right? Mm-hmm. So why would you do that when you're going for an interview or going for a talk? Because everything that you already know is already in you.
Very true.
You just gotta, yeah.
God forbid you have a brain fart.
Yeah, exactly.
In the middle of an interview, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this topic with me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it.
Yeah. As you know, I'm brand new and I'm trying to set up a podcast, and I have to research everything before I take that first step. So
yeah.
And I got so much information from you, and I highly appreciate it. And I love what you've done with your podcast.
Thank you.
Not sure how you do all those tiny little pieces. I'm gonna guess it's your team, because because I looked at your blog.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have the time to kind of like detail. Not every podcaster does that.
Yeah.
Having the time to go in there and put down everything that you should expect from the actual interview.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And it's just amazing the amount of work you do.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christine. This was a really fun conversation. Again, it helped me, every time I talk about this, it helps me learn more about myself because I can be more clear on how things are gonna flow. But yeah. Okay. I gotta run as well. I've got somebody knocking at the door.
Okay. Well, thanks again. I'll let
you
go back to all the stuff you're doing.
We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.